Ninth graders, I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 2 from Of Mice and Men for you guys today. Chapter 2 starts on page 17. If you remember from chapter 1, George and Lenny were hanging out down by the creek, and they were planning to go up for their new job the next day. The reason they didn't go for their job today is because George kind of wanted to rest before they go in for their first day of work. Okay, so if you remember the plan is that Lenny is not supposed to talk until after the boss can see what a hard worker he is. So let's see if Lenny can remember the plan. The bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls, there were small, square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets, and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles: soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves, and little vials, combs, and from nails on the box sides a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. Okay, if I try to compare this to what I can picture in my mind, to me it looks kind of like if you've ever been to summer camp, maybe, or in 6th grade when you guys went to science camp up at Sierra Outdoor School. It kind of reminds me of the way that the dorms look for you guys. It's a big room. It's got all these different bunk beds. There's a stove because that's what they used to keep warm at that time. So they wouldn't have central heating like we do. They would just use a stove. The stove, is one of those, it resembles a fireplace. It has a window on the front and you can see the fire inside, and it's really good at radiating heat out to the rest of the room. We can see that in the men's spare time, they like to play cards and things like that. But it's just really like, if you can picture this room, it's very, very bare. There's not any decorations or anything like that. And so, again, it just reminds me of the dorms where you guys would stay when you go away to camp. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised, the door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans, and he carried a big push broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. Okay, so the guy who kind of like shows them into the bunkhouse, he is pretty much um he he is, I think, I'm drawing a blank on what they call him, but he is the one who keeps the rooms clean and stuff like that. He is a really older man and he's missing one of his arms. So rather than go out with the machines and try to, harvest their crops and things like that, this man has taken a job cleaning the bunkhouse and keeping everything clean for them. We'll find out his name in just a minute. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack. Oh, yes, no, yes. Okay, sorry guys. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell's this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. What the hell kind of bed you giving us, anyways? We don't want no pants rabbits. The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. Tell you what, he said finally. Last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella and as clean as any guy you would want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate. Then how come he got graybacks? George was working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. Okay, so basically, the bunk that George was given, uh, the person who lived there before him had left behind a can of pretty much bug spray. It's to get rid of the bugs in any of the bedding or in the surrounding area. And George takes it to mean that he's been given a dirty bunk that's infested with bugs. I remembered what they call the old man. They call the old man the swamper. He's in charge again of cleaning the bunkhouse. And he says, no, no, don't worry. The bed does not have bugs. The person who lived here before you was such a clean guy that he just sprayed the bug spray there just in case to keep the bugs away. Does that make sense? So he's trying to tell George it's not a big deal. This bed is not bug infested. Tell you what, said the old swamper. This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals, he'd peel his boiled potatoes and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was. Clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even and then sat in the bunkhouse. I ain't so sure, said George skeptically. What did you say he quit for? The old man put the yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. Why, he just quit the way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reasons but the food. Just says, give me my time one night, the way any guy would. Okay, so back then it was pretty common for these migrant workers to just go from place to place, not really giving any kind of real reason why he's sick of being in this place. And that's what the swamper is trying to tell George. He just said he was ready to move. He didn't like the food, and that was pretty much it. George lifted his tick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately, Lenny got up and did the same with his bed. Finally, George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, I guess the boss'll be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eating breakfast and says, where's the hell's them new men? And he gave the stable buck hell too. Okay, so they're coming in to a situation where the boss is already pretty mad. They were supposed to arrive for their job yesterday. We already heard why they didn't, but the boss was mad when they weren't there this morning to start working. George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. Give the stable buck hell, he said. Sure. You see, the stable buck's black. Black, huh? Yeah, nice fella, too. Got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss gives him hell when he's mad, but the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room. Okay, so the stable buck is African American, and for some reason, whenever the boss is mad, he yells at the stable buck. That's like his easy target that he can take his aggression out on. But we know that the stable buck, at least according to the swamper, the stable buck is actually a pretty nice guy. What kind of guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, know what he done Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right in here and says, drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did, a whole gallon? Yes, sir. We had fun. They let the stable buck come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after him. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the black man got him. If he could have used his feet, Smitty says he would have killed him. The guy said on account of the black man's got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that, the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Okay, so George wants to know what the boss is like. Is he a nice guy? And to illustrate what a nice guy he is, the swamper says, well, on Christmas time, he gave us a whole gallon of whiskey to drink. And then he says that there was a guy named Smitty who picked a fight with the stable buck, pretty much picked a fight with him because of the fact that he was black. But we can tell that the other men who work there on the ranch like the stable buck and don't care that he is black, because when Smitty wanted to fight him, they told Smitty, okay, but he has a hurt back. You can't use your feet in the fight. You can only use your hands. And that's why the stable buck was actually the one to win the fight. Lenny was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. Them guys just come, he said, and shuffled past the boss out the door. Okay, so this is the boss that we're about to meet. We can tell he's the boss because of the way that he's dressed. Like, even his shoes, you've probably seen in like old Western movies, how some like cowboy boots would have a little bit of a heel on the back of them and might have that spur with a star on it, like just to look fancy, like it's not something you would go working on a ranch in. So that's how we can tell that this is the boss and that he's not one of the laborers. The boss stepped into the room with short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. I wrote Murray and Reddy I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips? George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning. George looked down at his feet. Bus driver gave us a bum steer, he said. We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning. The boss squinted his eyes. Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner. He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. What's your name? George Milton. Okay, so the reason George just gave Lenny a look right now is to kind of like, don't forget, you're not supposed to talk. Okay, so right now the boss is going to talk to Lenny, so let's see how this all goes down. What's your name? George Milton. And what's yours? George said, his name's Lenny, Lenny Small. Don't you think that's an ironic name for Lenny, Lenny Small? The names were entered in the book. Let's see, this is the 20th, noon the 20th. He closed the book. Where you boys been working? Up around weeds, said George. You too? To Lenny. Yeah, him too, said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. He ain't much of a talker, is he? No, he ain't, but he's sure a hell of a good worker. Strong as a bull. Lenny smiled to himself. Strong as a bull, he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, Listen, Small. Lenny raised his head. What can you do? In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. He can do anything you tell him, said George. He's a good skinner. He can rustle grain bags, drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. The boss turned on George. Then why don't you let him answer? What you trying to put over? George broke in loudly. Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But I say he's a good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale. The boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted one eye nearly closed. Say, what you sellin'? Huh? I said, what stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay away from him? No, course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out? Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is. George said, he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right, just ain't bright, but he can do anything you tell him. The boss turned half away. Well, God knows you don't need any brains to buck barley bags, but don't you try to put nothing over, Milton. I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit and weed? Job was done, said George promptly. What kind of job? We we was digging a cesspool. All right, but don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team. Slim? Yeah, big tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went out, he turned and looked for a long moment at the two men. Okay, so Lenny forgot kinda. He says a couple like he says, "Oh yeah, strong as a bull." But the boss is already suspicious. Are you noticing this? The boss is like, "Hang on. Why are you speaking for him? Are you gonna steal his paycheck or what is this?" So to kind of appease the boss, George says, "Oh no, he's my cousin. He's not smart. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. That's why he's not smart, but he's a really hard worker." Okay, so the plan is they're gonna go eat and they're gonna go in and eat, and then right after they eat, they'll go out with the teams. So if you noticed, the boss called it dinner. He said, "Come in, like go have dinner, and then you'll go out with the other team." Okay, for them, dinner was actually lunch. And I bet some of you guys know what they would call dinner, the evening meal, they would call it supper. Okay, so it was breakfast, dinner, supper. And I know that's weird to us, but that's what they're talking about when they say that. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. So you wasn't going to say a word? You was going to leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking? Damn near lost us the job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I got to talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we got to be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what do you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. Hang on, you guys, sorry. No, listen, don't come in here and ask me questions right now. When I'm all done, I'll come downstairs, okay? Okay, so lost my place. Okay, so Lenny knows the real story, and so he's like, George, I wasn't kicked in the head by a horse, was I? And George is like, it would be so much easier for everyone if you had. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door, and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing listening? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute, scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you were saying. A guy on a ranch don't never listen, nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and set down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. He was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall, and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed all right. He's a nice fellow, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him right. At that, a young man came into the bunkhouse, a thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes, and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and, like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. Seen my old man? He asked. Okay, so we're meeting a lot of the different characters in this chapter, and it can get a little bit confusing. Okay, let me see if I can get it straight so that I can review it for you. Okay, so the old man that has the old dog and he's missing his hand, okay, he is the swamper. The swamper is kind of like the janitor maybe of the place. And we haven't found out his name yet, but we will soon. Okay, then we also meet the boss. We weren't told the boss's name. The boss seems fair. He does seem like he's going to keep a close eye on George and Lenny. Okay, then we have the Skinner named Slim is who they're supposed to go out with on the team. And we'll meet him later too. He's kind of an important character. But the character who just walked in, he is an important character. He is the boss's son. And he kind of like walks around like he owns the place. He's a snob. He wants to fight all the time. He's not the most likable character. And so in he comes and he asks George and Lenny and the swamper, have you seen my dad? The swamper said, he was here just a minute ago, Curly. Went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. Case of the boss's son, his name is Curly. His eyes passed over the new men and he stopped. He glanced coldly over George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George said, suppose you don't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he's got to talk when he's spoke to. What the hell are you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk? Is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop that for part 1, and then I'll pick up with the second half of the chapter in the next video.